Picture this. It's 922 AD, and a Muslim diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan is traveling through Viking territory. What he witnesses at a funeral ceremony is so horrifying, so unbelievable, that when he writes it down, people dismiss it as pure propaganda for centuries. But here's the kicker. Modern archaeology has proven that every single disturbing detail he described was absolutely true. And that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to how Vikings used sex as their ultimate weapon of psychological warfare. You see, in Viking society, your sexual role wasn't just about intimacy. It literally determined whether you lived or died, whether you were a citizen or an outcast, whether you had any rights at all or were treated like human garbage. They created this absolutely insane system where violence and pleasure were so intertwined that you couldn't separate them. And the consequences of being on the wrong side of their sexual hierarchy were more brutal than anything you've ever imagined. Let me blow your mind with this. There were two words in Old Norse, arger and rager, that basically meant sexually passive or feminine. But get this, being called these names wasn't just an insult, it was literally a death sentence. Under Viking law, if someone called you these words, you were legally justified in murdering them on the spot. I'm not exaggerating. Their legal system actually protected your right to kill someone for suggesting you weren't sexually dominant enough. Can you even imagine living in a society where a single word about your bedroom performance could end your entire existence? But it gets so much worse. If you were labeled as sexually passive, you lost everything. We're talking about losing your right to testify in court, your right to inherit property, your right to carry weapons, your right to vote in their assemblies. Basically, you became a non-person overnight. Your citizenship status was literally determined by what happened between the sheets, and there was no coming back from that social death. The sagas are absolutely filled with blood feuds that started over sexual insults. In the saga of Burnt Njal, entire families were wiped out because someone made a joke about another man's sexual performance. In Egil's saga, warriors went on decade-long revenge quests over implications of sexual weakness. And here's the twisted part. Viking women learned to weaponize these insults against their own husbands. They would publicly shame their men with sexual accusations, knowing it would force them into violence to restore their honor. It created this absolutely vicious cycle, where men had to constantly prove their dominance through increasingly brutal displays of masculinity. Now, if you think that's disturbing, wait until you hear about their warfare tactics. Vikings didn't just want to defeat their enemies, they wanted to completely destroy their souls, their identities, their very essence as human beings. They developed something called need-hug, which translates to shame stroke, and it involved the symbolic anal penetration of defeated enemies. But this wasn't just symbolic humiliation. They believed that forcing someone into a passive sexual role literally transferred their masculine essence to the victor. Archaeological evidence shows that Vikings systematically sexually assaulted captured leaders and warriors, not just for pleasure, but as a calculated psychological weapon. They understood that in their honor-based culture, sexual violation was worse than death. Victims would often commit suicide rather than live with the shame, which is exactly what the Vikings wanted. They had turned sexual assault into an art form of psychological destruction. And speaking of systematic horror, let's talk about their slave trade. The Vikings operated what can only be described as industrial-scale sexual enslavement. The slave markets in Dublin and York were absolutely packed with captives whose primary purpose was intimate exploitation. Archaeological evidence suggests that up to 30% of Dublin's population were slaves, and most of them were there for sexual purposes. They created this two-tier legal system where free women had unprecedented rights for medieval Europe, but enslaved women had absolutely zero protection. This created the most twisted paradox you've ever heard. Free Viking women could divorce their husbands for sexual inadequacy. They could inherit land, run businesses, propose marriage. They had more rights than women wouldn't have, again, for centuries. But enslaved women? They were treated as disposable objects for the most degrading purposes imaginable. The Vikings intentionally created this stark contrast to reinforce just how valuable freedom was, and how completely worthless enslaved people became. But perhaps the most shocking part of all this is how sexuality was embedded into their most sacred rituals. When Vikings got married, the consummation wasn't private. It was a public legal requirement. Family witnesses had to confirm that proper penetration had occurred, or the marriage could be declared invalid. We're talking about family members literally escorting the couple to bed and listening outside to make sure everything was happening correctly. The bloodied sheets from the wedding night were examined and preserved as legal documents. Some families even stayed in the room during consummation to witness it firsthand. There were legal penalties if the groom couldn't perform sexually on the wedding night. Can you imagine the psychological pressure of having your most intimate moments scrutinized by your in-laws as a legal requirement? And then we get to their funeral rituals, which were so disturbing that when Ibn Fadlan described them, historians refused to believe it for over 1,000 years. When a Viking chieftain died, they would hold what can only be described as a multi-day orgy designed to transfer life force to the deceased. A slave girl would be selected for ritual sacrifice, and she would spend days having intimate relations with multiple tribal men because they believed sexual contact could transfer spiritual essence. On the final day, 6 different men, representing different aspects of tribal power, would have relations with her before she was ritually murdered during the sexual act by a woman they called the Angel of Death. This wasn't just random brutality. This was a carefully orchestrated religious ceremony that combined sexuality, spirituality, and human sacrifice into one horrifying ritual. And archaeological evidence from places like the Oseberg ship burial has confirmed that these practices actually happened. The sexual politics even extended to their gods. Loki was constantly mocked for taking female form, while Odin was criticized for practicing cider magic, which was considered feminine and sexually deviant. They had this complex legal attitude where homosexuality itself wasn't prohibited, but accusations of sexual passivity could ruin your life forever. The pressure to maintain masculine dominance shaped literally every aspect of their society, from their legal system to their religious beliefs. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was how they turned sexual violence into public entertainment. Their justice system doubled as sadistic theater, with public sexual assault and castration serving as both punishment and amusement for the crowds. They held festivals featuring sexual violence against prisoners, with people literally betting on how long torture victims would survive. Archaeological evidence from execution sites shows ritualized sexual violence was a regular part of their public spectacles. The Vikings had essentially created a society where sexual dominance wasn't just personal preference, it was the foundation of their entire civilization. They used sexuality to reinforce power hierarchies, to control populations, to destroy enemies, and to maintain social order through the most extreme methods imaginable. These weren't random acts of violence. These were calculated, systematic strategies that helped them conquer and control vast territories across medieval Europe. And here's the thing that will absolutely blow your mind. Their influence didn't end with the Viking Age. The DNA studies show Viking genetic markers spread across continents. Their legal concepts influenced medieval European law. Their ideas about masculinity and dominance became embedded in Western culture in ways we're still discovering today. When we talk about toxic masculinity, when we examine rape culture, when we look at how sexuality has been weaponized throughout history, the Viking model is right there at the foundation of it all. So the next time someone romanticizes Viking culture or talks about how badass they were, remember this. They created a civilization where your sexual role could literally determine whether you lived or died, where human trafficking for sexual exploitation was a cornerstone of their economy, and where the most sacred religious ceremonies involved ritualized sexual violence and human sacrifice. This wasn't just ancient history. This was a systematic blueprint for using sexuality as the ultimate weapon of social control, and its effects are still rippling through our culture today. The archaeological evidence keeps mounting, the historical sources keep being confirmed, and the full scope of Viking sexual practices keeps getting more disturbing with every new discovery. What Ahmad ibn Fadlan witnessed in 922 AD wasn't an isolated incident. It was just one glimpse into a society that had weaponized sexuality in ways that modern minds can barely comprehend.